Welcome back to class, everyone. Grab a seat. Today, we're diving right into an explainer that puts military history under a slightly different kind of microscope. We're not just mapping out troop movements or analyzing battlefield tactics today. No, we're looking at something arguably just as crucial: the actual names of these military operations. An operations name is way, way more than just a boring bureaucratic label. It's a powerful tool of psychological warfare, it's a bold statement of intent, and ultimately, it's a permanent reflection of historical legacy. When a commander slaps a name on a mission, they are literally setting the psychological stage for both their soldiers and their enemies. So let's get right into it. Now, you might be wondering, how do these names actually get chosen? Well, sometimes the absolute most legendary names in history happen completely by accident. Just consider the miracle at Dunkirk back in May 1940. You had over 338,000 British troops pinned down on French beaches by the German invasion. Winston Churchill was understandably furiously demanding that a rescue operation began right that second, and he told his commanding officer that the mission needed a name. As the story goes, and you might have seen this highlighted in the film Darkest Hour, the officer simply glanced up, saw a physical, electrical dynamo sitting there with a metal badge that read Dynamo, and boom, that was it. Operation Dynamo was officially born. It's a brilliant example of how sometimes the absolute best names are the ones you just don't overthink. Okay, here's our syllabus for today's explainer. We're going to be analyzing these operations across 4 distinct eras: World War II epics, Cold War conflicts, rescues and retaliations, and finally, the modern era. Starting off with Section 1, World War II epics, where the names carried some serious mythological weight. Look, in the European theater of the Second World War, the stakes were literally the survival of the free world. And honestly, the operation names carried a grand, almost mythological weight to match that reality. We just talked about Operation Dynamo in 1940, pulling Allied forces back from the absolute brink of destruction. Then, we see a massive pivot in 1941 with Operation Barbarossa, the enormous Axis invasion of the Soviet Union. And finally, the crushing return to the continent in 1944 with Operation Overlord, the famous D-Day invasion of France, an operation so highly classified that its outcome essentially settled the war in Europe on June 6th. Just think about the sheer psychological weight of a word like Overlord for a second. Read that word out loud and tell me it doesn't sound like the bringer of doom from some epic medieval fantasy or a sci-fi video game. Ultimate success must have felt absolutely inevitable to the Allies from the very second someone pitched that name. It just projects total, unquestionable dominance, doesn't it? Then, on the flip side of the conflict, we have Operation Barbarossa. This was the largest invasion force ever assembled in human history, over 3 million Axis troops. But let me pose a quick question to the class here. How exactly did a German military operation get an Italian name? Well, Barbarossa is Italian for red beard. It was named after Frederick I, this incredibly charismatic German king who actually became the Holy Roman Emperor way back in 1155. But here is the tragic historical irony of it all. Frederick actually died in Asia Minor while leading the Third Crusade. So, naming the invasion of the USSR after a leader whose Grand Eastern Crusade ended in his own demise, that perfectly, almost eerily foreshadows the practical end of Germany's attempt to rule Europe after their absolutely crushing defeat at Stalingrad. Moving right along to Section 2, Cold War conflicts, an era completely defined by ideology and destruction. As the geopolitical landscape shifted from total global war to these incredibly tense ideological standoffs, the naming conventions adapted too, reflecting both some weird bureaucratic quirks and devastating new realities. Let's set the scene. In 1948, the Soviet Union blockaded access to the western sectors of Berlin. Facing starving citizens, President Truman authorized a massive, year-long airlift of life-saving food. Now, if you leave it to military bureaucrats, they would have probably come up with something incredibly dull, right? Something like Operation Food Basket or Operation Dinner Table. A British official might have even suggested the terribly dry Operation Victuals. But it took a red-blooded American to cut right through that red tape and call it exactly what it was: Operation Vittles. I love it. It's grounded, it's memorable, and it tells you exactly what's on the menu. Now, let's turn the page to a much darker chapter. Rolling Thunder was the 1967 to 1968 bombing campaign of North Vietnam. American generals were absolutely certain it would break the enemy's will. And yes, it did cause massive damage. But history revealed that the U.S. deeply, deeply underestimated the Vietnamese commitment to unified self-government. Still, strictly from a branding perspective, Rolling Thunder is incredibly evocative. It conjures up literal waves of inescapable, deafening destruction. In fact, the name was so powerful that it later inspired a gritty William Devon B-movie, which, funnily enough, actually inspired the name of director Quentin Tarantino's own movie production company. I want you to pause for a second and really consider the geopolitical debate of 1983. Was a U.S. invasion of Grenada an absolutely necessary measure to prevent a domino effect of pro-Soviet regimes in the Americas? Or was it an outsized reaction to a tiny Caribbean nation of just 91,000 people flirting with communism? Look, whatever your historical verdict on the invasion of Grenada might be, we have to admit the name is spectacular. Operation Urgent Fury. I mean, wow. The conflict was over in a week, with 19 U.S. personnel killed and 116 wounded. But that title, Urgent Fury, sounds exactly like an action movie where Chuck Norris and Jean-Claude Van Damme play these grizzled special ops leaders, joining forces to put down the Sandinistas once and for all. It just perfectly captures that super aggressive, muscular posture of the 1980s Cold War era. All right, on to Section 3, rescues and retaliations. We're talking incredibly high-stakes missions here. Let's examine 3 highly sensitive, truly unforgettable missions. These were surgical strikes, massive extractions, and deeply personal operations where precision was absolutely paramount and the stakes literally couldn't have been higher. First up, Operation Magic Carpet from 1949 to 1950. This was a secret airlift bringing nearly 50,000 Yemenite Jews across the Arabian deserts to the newly formed state of Israel. Honestly, a truly magical name for flying refugees to safety. Then we have Operation Thunderbolt in 1976, which is the famous Entebbe raid. And finally, Operation Wrath of God, the intense Mossad retaliatory campaign that stretched across the 1970s and 80s. Let's actually focus in on Operation Thunderbolt for a moment. Picture this. July 4th, 1976, the American bicentennial no less. Israeli forces executed a stunningly daring rescue of 94 Israeli passengers and 12 crew members from a grounded Air France flight over in Uganda, which had been hijacked by German PLO sympathizers. It is widely considered one of the greatest military successes of the 20th century. The story was so enormous, so globally gripping, that it inspired 2 star-studded TV movies that exact same year, and even more recently, the feature film 7 Days in Entebbe. Thunderbolt is a name that strikes incredibly fast, incredibly bright, and with an absolutely deafening impact. Now contrast that kind of sudden lightning strike with a long, slow, deliberate burn. Following the absolutely horrific massacre of 11 Israeli athletes and coaches by Palestinian terrorists from Black September at the 1972 Munich Olympics, Israel's intelligence agency, the Mossad, launched a massive 16-year covert retaliation operation. The name they chose? Operation Wrath of God. Does a name like that really need any explanation? I don't think so. It directly invokes an Old Testament God known for spells of fierce, unyielding anger and vengeance. As our source material rightly points out, Black September simply didn't stand a chance against a literal mission from God. And that brings us to Section 4, the modern era. This is where pop culture and the 24-hour news cycle really take the wheel. So, as we entered the 1990s and moved into the 2000s, military operations began to be shaped heavily, and I mean heavily, by the dawn of the 24-hour news cycle and the incredibly pervasive influence of American pop culture. In 1990, after Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait, President George H.W. Bush launched a 6-week war to retake the country. The mission was famously dubbed Operation Desert Storm. Think about the literal definition of that for a second. A massive weather event created entirely by wind and sand. It's sudden, it's completely ruthless, and it is incredibly disorienting. And frankly, that is exactly what the coalition forces unleashed on the Iraqi army. And this actually brings up a really fascinating comparative point drawn directly from our sources. When you compare that 1990 conflict with the later 2003 invasion, the naming conventions shifted in a really noticeable way. Operation Desert Storm evokes this unforgettable, primal, natural fury. On the other hand, while of course honoring the men and women who fought in the war on terror, the source material notes that a name like Operation Iraqi Freedom is much more of an abstract concept, right? It simply lacks that same visceral, elemental fury that makes you sit up and take notice. You also have to remember that Operation Desert Storm was entirely unique because it was incredibly fast and it won widespread home front support. But why? Well, a big part of it is because the American public was watching it happen live from their living rooms. The fledgling news network CNN provided excellent, unprecedented real-time 24-hour television coverage. The aggressive branding of the operation and the highly visual broadcast of the storm in action were just perfectly synced up for a modern, televised audience. Let's fast forward a bit to December 2003, during the later U.S. invasion of Iraq. American forces were relentlessly hunting for Saddam Hussein. Now, unlike Osama bin Laden, who ended up spending his final days in relative luxury, Hussein was tracked down hiding in a tiny, squalid spider hole in the dirt. The mission that finally captured him, it was called Operation Red Dawn. But why Red Dawn? I mean, of all the names. Well, because it was explicitly named after the 1984 film. Yes, the actual movie featuring a group of regular American teenagers forming a guerrilla force to fight off a Soviet invasion, complete with local hunters teaching the girls how to shoot. It is widely considered one of the absolute greatest pro-American movies ever made. Giving this totally legendary pop culture name to the real-world mission that bagged a brutal dictator, it's just a brilliant, almost surreal crossover between actual military history and pure, triumphant pop culture. Which brings us to the end of today's curriculum. But before you pack up, I want to leave you with a final thought to really ponder. When the dust finally settles on the battlefield and all the brilliant tactical maneuvers fade into the distant past, how much does the actual name of an operation shape its legacy in the history books? Decades from now, do we remember the dry logistics, or do we remember the overlords, the thunderbolts, and the desert storms? It really makes you think. A name is history's very first draft. All right, thanks for joining me for this explainer today. Class dismissed, and keep learning.